everybody. Hope you're doing well today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about promises. Did you ever make a promise to somebody, and then how did you confirm that promise? Did you maybe shake hands together?
Boom.
Okay.
Boom. A couple of these.
Or maybe you sign a contract, or like in a wedding, for example, you exchange rings as a symbol of the assurance of that promise. Or maybe when you were a kid, did you ever do the whole pinky promise thing? Like you would shake pinkies together, and that was like the most steadfast, firm promise that you could ever make. Well, today in Genesis chapter 15, we are going to see how God confirms his promises to Abram through this covenant confirmation ceremony. Now, there's some weird cultural stuff going on. We're going to try and unpack that a bit. Now, I want you to take a second, pause this video, and go read Genesis chapter 15 if you haven't already. Okay, let's start at the beginning, verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. A few things to notice here. First, the only timestamp that we get says after these things. Okay, so that just indicates that it's after the events of chapter 14. The next thing I want us to notice is that the word used for the Lord there, you see the small caps. That means that the word in the Hebrew is Yahweh. That the name for God throughout this passage is Yahweh. That is God's covenant name. And so it's appropriate that that name is used in this text because God is making a covenant with Abram. In this vision, God says to Abram, "Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Now, if you remember back to chapter 14, a bunch of the kings in the north had come down and defeated and conquered a bunch of the kings in the south and took all their people and their possessions and whatnot. And so then Abram comes along and he goes to rescue his brother, or his nephew Lot, from the kings in the north. And so he goes and he defeats them and brings all of the possessions and the people back to the kings in the south. But he specifically doesn't keep any of that wealth for himself, because he says that he didn't want people to think that the people in the land are who made him rich, but he becomes wealthy through God, and God is the one who provides for him. So then we turn to chapter 15, and God says, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. I am the one who will protect you in this land where you're living on your own, in the midst of a bunch of foreigners. Your reward shall be very great." Again, God is the one who provides reward for Abram. But then Abram has an objection here. He says, "Oh Lord God, what will you give me? What will this reward be? It certainly won't be generational wealth, because I have no offspring of my own to pass it on to. I have no heir. The heir of my household at the moment is Eliezer of Damascus." That would have been Abram's chief servant. That's who would receive his inheritance, because he didn't have his own son. But then God responds, repeating to Abram the promise that he made back in Genesis chapter 12. But now very specifically, he says, "This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And then he takes him outside and tells him to look up at the night sky and try and count the stars. Now, I know these days, for those people who live in the city or near a city, there's a lot of light pollution, and so when you look up at the stars at night, it's like, oh, that's nice. But if you ever get away from the city, get out into the bush, and on a night particularly where there's no moon out at the time, and look up at the sky, the stars are innumerable. And so God says, if you can even count them, like that's how many your descendants will be. And then we see Abram's response in verse 6. "And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." Abram had faith. That's the Hebrew word here is the word for faith. Abraham had faith that God would fulfill his promise. And so then Yahweh, counted it to him, Abram, as righteousness. It's Abram's faith that was counted as righteous. Abram isn't righteous in and of himself. It's not his obedience that made him righteous. It's not his good works that made him righteous. It is his belief in God, this faith in God that God would fulfill his promises. That's what is credited to his account as righteousness. Now, New Testament writers pick up on this as a really key verse. For example, in Romans chapter 4, Paul is talking about how salvation is by faith and not by works. And so he uses Abram as an illustration, pointing back to Genesis 15, verse 6. Abram was justified, that is, that he was declared righteous by his faith, not by his works. And then over in Galatians chapter 3, Paul is arguing against legalism or this kind of salvation by works mentality when he says that salvation comes through faith. And so he points back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 and says, Abraham, he's the father of the faithful, that those who believe and have faith are the children of Abraham. And then in James chapter 2, James is talking about how our faith is demonstrated or completed by our works. And so he points to Abram as an illustration. Abraham's internal faith was demonstrated by his obedience. And then in Hebrews chapter 11, the famous Hall of Faith chapter, in verses 11 and 12, the author points back to the promises that God's making here in Genesis chapter 15. And he says that they considered God as one who is faithful to fulfill his promises. And thus Abram and Sarah are commended for their faith. So then there in verses 1 through 6, we have this little conversation between God and Abram, specifically related to the offspring promise. But then, if we're trying to kind of outline the chapter a little bit, there's another conversation that focuses more specifically on the land promise. So God continues in chapter verse 7, and he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. Again, he talks about who he is. God says, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So he's relating to Abram's land. In chapter 12, he said, leave from your land and your people and your family. And so God's calling him out of that land. He says, to give you this land to possess. So he's not only calling him out of that land, but now he has another land that he's giving to Abram. But then Abram has another objection. Oh, Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Now, we shouldn't think of this as like doubt on Abram's behalf. He says, God, are you really sure that you can do all this? No, it's not doubt at all, but he's seeking assurance. He's seeking confirmation of this promise that God's making. And this is now setting us up for this covenant confirmation ceremony that happens in the following verses. So let's unpack this a little bit. Then God says to him, bring me a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Okay, what is this all about? It sounds like a bad joke. So a heifer, goat, and a ram walk into a bar. So Abram brought these things, cuts them in half, and then lays each half over against the other with this aisle down the middle, except the birds he didn't cut in half. And as what happens with dead animals, there's like birds and stuff coming down, the birds of prey, vultures and things that are coming to try and eat these animals, and Abram's scaring them away. This is actually a common cultural practice of the day of a covenant confirmation ceremony. Now, the Hebrew word for covenant actually comes from the word to cut. So they literally cut a covenant. What would happen is when a king would make an agreement with a vassal or a servant, they would have this kind of a ceremony where they would take a sacrifice animal, cut it in half, and put it on two sides, and then walk between the pieces. And what that is symbolizing is saying that if I break my side of the covenant, whatever agreements I'm making here, whatever I'm promising to, if I break those promises, then may what has happened to these animals happen to me. If I break my side of the covenant, may I be cut off. May my body be destroyed and killed and thrown on the ground as food for the carrion animals. This is an enactment of the covenant curse. It's the consequences that would come upon them if they broke their side of the covenant. This is a serious agreement. So what are the promises that God is then making in this covenant? We find that in verses 13 to 16, again 18 to 21 there. God reinforces the land promise that he made from all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, specifically verse 7. He repeats it again in chapter 13, and now he repeats it again here. He says, Abram, I'm going to give your offspring this land in which you're living, where right now the Canaanites and the Amorites and all the other ites are living in the land. That's going to belong to your offspring. But there's going to be a delay. And so he talks about this in verses 13 to 16. When he says, know for certain that your offspring, they're going to go and be sojourners, or they're going to be foreigners living in a land that's not their own, and they're going to end up being servants there, and they're going to end up being afflicted for 400 years. After that time, I'm going to bring them up out of that land and back in to take possession of this land. Okay, but there's going to be a delay. Now, he mentions that this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we think about it, it just makes sense that if Israel is going to become enough people, a big enough army to be able to destroy all of the Canaanites, then certainly they would need some time to populate. Secondly, he says specifically in verse 16, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity or for the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. So what this is saying is that when Israel comes back to destroy the Amorites and the Canaanites and all these people, the reason is because of their sin. Okay, the Amorites are earning judgment upon themselves by their own sin. But again, we see God's mercy in judgment. This is not going to happen for another 400 years. God is giving them 400 years of his patience to turn and repent. However, they never do. And eventually the Israelites will come back and enact God's judgment upon the Amorites for the sin that they've committed. But God says to Abram, it's going to be your descendants who come and take possession of this land. But as for you, you're going to die in peace at a good old age. Why even mention the delay in the first place? Well, it's a powerful affirmation that even though it won't happen immediately, God will still fulfill his promises. And then something really surprising happens. Let's look at these verses carefully. In verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. These words for dread and darkness, it's the same kind of picture that we get on Mount Sinai when God's presence descends on top of the mountain. Look again down in verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. In fact, this fire and smoke is the same thing. Remember that the Israelites have been following through the wilderness. So we have smoke and fire and darkness and dread. And this is exactly what we see in pictures of God's presence. The original readers, the Israelites on the edge of the promised land, would have read this story and recognized the presence of God. That's what's being symbolized here. But then what happens? The smoking fire pot and the flaming torch pass down the aisle through the pieces of dead animals by themselves.
Great Scott!
Abram is sleeping. He doesn't go through with God. God's presence. God goes through the pieces by himself. Okay, why is this so significant? Because remember what's happening here is they are enacting the covenant curses that would, if they broke the promise, then may this happen to them. Now, ordinarily, the king and the vassal would both walk through, or perhaps just the vassal would walk through by himself, bringing or enacting those covenant curses upon himself. But here, God goes through the pieces by himself. And what he's saying is that, Abram, whether I break my side of the covenant or whether you break your side of the covenant, I am taking the covenant curses upon myself. on your behalf. Even if you break your side of the covenant, I will take that curse upon myself. I'm the one that will be cut off. It's my body that will be broken. It's my blood that will be poured out on the ground. This is a powerful picture of the gospel. It's mankind who sinned and broke their side of the covenant and rebelled against God. But it was God himself who took the curse of the covenant upon himself. Mark chapter 15, verse 33. There was another darkness that came over the face of the earth while Jesus hung on the cross. All right, Isaiah 53, verse 8 says, He was cut off from the land of the living. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Galatians 3:13 says Christ took on the curse of the covenant. He became a curse for us. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, hanging on the cross, took that covenant curse upon himself so that he could fulfill his promise to provide salvation and blessing to all nations. So that now we, like Abram, who believe, who put our faith in God, trusting that God is able and does fulfill his promises through the person of Jesus Christ, we are welcomed into the family of God, not by our works, not by our obedience, but by believing that Christ took the curse that we deserved on the cross, on himself, in our place, on our behalf, and we become part of the family of God. So here in Genesis 15, we get a bit graphic, but actually a beautiful picture of the gospel, of God taking the curse of sin upon himself in the person of Jesus Christ,